Okay, let me respond with a couple points related to both the 1930s and Japan. The 1930s U.S. policy was fairly convoluted, although we like to think about it as this great New Deal in terms of massive expansion of government spending. That happened, but it wasn't that big compared to what later happened during World War II. There were attempts to balance the budget, raise taxes, restrict the money supply. There are lots of things that were done. They really weren't a very coherent set of policies. So government did not necessarily become the full Keynesian policies that we'd normally want. In fact, John Maynard Keynes got so upset with FDR that he wanted to write a letter to say how upset he was with the way in which he was trying to implement things. So I don't think the 30s is a perfect thing. And as I mentioned already, the 1930s, like our current situation, was built on a huge amount of debt from the private sector. And if you're paying back your debt, you're in deep trouble in terms of trying to be able to grow any kind of an economy. In World War II is when we actually came out of that, and that's when the government actually really blew up the deficit in terms of really spending lots of money. We increased the national debt tremendously, but the economy grew, people went to work, and we began the beginning of what became the post-war boom. After that, of course, many of the other economies had to be rebuilt after World War II. Now, with Japan, the situation is if you think about what happened in Japan, Japan had a huge real estate bubble too that burst. There was a time when a little square foot in Tokyo would just, the price of that was just astronomical. And if you think about how much our stock market has fallen, earlier this week the Dow hit around low 6,000s, roughly about a 60% drop from its peak. Could you imagine it going all the way down to 3,000? That's what happened in Japan. They lost 80% of their stock market valuation. It was a tremendous thing. It's a miracle, if you actually really think about it, that they didn't go into a depression. How did they avoid it? They did avoid it by doing large amounts of fiscal stimulus to grow the economy. What did they do wrong? What they did wrong is what I'm afraid Obama and team might be doing wrong, which is they kept throwing money at what we call zombie banks. A zombie bank is a bank which, if you were to liquidate their assets, they wouldn't have enough to cover their liabilities. An asset for a bank might be a mortgage on a house the house that they own, but now the house isn't worth very much. From the real estate bubble. The liabilities are like demand deposits, the checking accounts you might have at your bank. Now, the zombie banks are the banks that if you liquidate their assets, they can't really pay back their liabilities. You can keep funneling money to them, but if that's a fundamental problem with them, you need a different way to do it. Sweden did a very good job in the early 1990s of doing that. Basically, they told the banks, look, if they look at how much capital the banks had in terms of which is basically the main ownership of the banks. And if they were undercapitalized, they said, you got to raise more capital. If you don't raise more capital, the government will provide capital for you. We're going to essentially nationalize the banks that can't do that. At this point in time, there's a lot of concern out there that our banks are in deep trouble. The main reason the stock market went up so high today was because there was word that Citigroup actually may have made money for the last 2 months, and so they might not be a zombie bank. There's a lot of concern that Citigroup and perhaps other banks are zombie banks, and what lots of people are coming forward with, and this is Alan Greenspan, I mentioned John McCain, Paul Krugman. These are people all over the ideological map are coming forward and saying we need to do something like Sweden, do some kind of a short-term nationalization. If banks cannot raise the private capital themselves, have government come in and step forward. And if we do that, what the government does provides the capital for the banks, begins to sell out some of the assets, and then resells the banks. We don't permanently nationalize banks. They resell the banks to the private sector so banks can do the lending that's so necessary. The final thing I just want to point out if you look at how important stimulus is, I mean, how many of you really want 11% unemployment? If you want that, that's what you're going to get if you don't have a stimulus program from our government. All the economic models will show you that. I've got one from Moody's here. The high blue lines shows us 11% unemployment through all of next year. What the stimulus program is doing, I mean, there's some people think it may not even be big enough, but the main thing it's got to do is sort of slow things down in terms of how badly we're losing jobs. People losing jobs means people hurt. it's very important that we be able to steer money to the people that most need it. And that includes the unemployed, as well as helping to improve our productive base by improving transportation structures so that we can become more efficient as an economy. We can do lots of good things with government spending when business is not in a capacity to do so. And in the process, we can build the demand in the society that will help create future growth. Thank you.